So today we're going to be talking about, in effect, blended threats, where, if you like, digital and information security bleeds over into physical security. Because I'm sure as we get talking, people will realise you're from the physical security side, and I were quite surprised because we're very interested to see how the two worlds do collide. But as soon as we started talking, you said they kind of already have. So I think a good way to get started, if you don't mind, would be to explain how you've ended up on this podcast with us today. A sort of brief background as to how you got involved in security as it is to you.
Yeah, okay, Vin, nice one. Nice to be here. Thank you for the invite. It's much appreciated. Yeah, a quick intro on me and my background. Joined the army as a young man, 16 years old, and that was my baptism into security. And then I've sort of maintained a trajectory in physical security since I left the military, joined Her Majesty's Prison Service as it was at the time, then became part of the Ministry of Justice National Tactical Response Group, which was very much around a training delivery as a primary role with an operational capacity of hostage intervention, working at high method of entry within the secure estate prisons, young offenders institute. I left that, went into private security in sort of East Africa primarily, South Sudan for a good portion of that. And then it was there that I sort of found the NGO world, and slowly from a country perspective, then became a country security manager, regional security director, moving into global security management to where I sit now as the head of global security at Mines Advisory Group, all very physical security focused. You know, Vin, as you touched on there, there's clearly in the modern age this convergence between the cyber digital threat that we encompass with the physical world as well. So it hence being here, and let's see if we can make all this work.
Fantastic. And for those who aren't familiar, maybe you can talk a little bit about what the Mines Advisory Group does.
Yeah, so we're what's classed as, we do humanitarian mine action globally. So we demine. So if you think of post-conflict environments primarily, then Syria, for example, I've just come back from Syria, where there's huge amounts of demining since the fall of the regime, and open access to far different areas of the country where there's been huge contamination. We will go in, remove the mines, manage the destruction and disposing of the mines, ultimately to give land back to people, right? So the land that they couldn't access for farming, for housing, for recreational activities, our purpose is to clear that land and return it to the people. And then there are subsidiary tasks. We do weapons and ammunition management, which is about the control of the proliferation of small arms and light weapons and ammunition around that as well. And we do this in around, across all the globe, in all the regions around the world. So yeah, keeps us busy.
Great work. And essentially cleaning up after conflict.
Pretty much, yeah. And as I say, if I look at the work in Latin America, with the proliferation of small arms, how do we prevent those falling into the hands of the wrong people, and keeping the public safe that way as well. So it's quite multifaceted, but yeah, it's keeping people safe ultimately.
Outstanding. Super worthwhile work. So, where does cyber factor into it?
Well, I mean, we're in the 21st century, right? I think we're naive if we think that technology isn't advancing at a rapid rate. I mean, I think, without being rude, I look at the three of us on the panel here. We probably remember technology being a rotary telephone, and it took a long time for a mobile phone to exist, right? And then we look at over the last sort of 10, 15 years, the speed of which that's changed. And,
absolutely,
to go to my original point with Vin when we first had the conversation, like the inception of AI as it is now, and what that brings to the fore. If I was to speak from an NGO perspective,
yes,
it's unlikely that we're going to be the victims of hackers from a negative perspective, right? From that cyber sort of area that you might expect a more corporate sort of level. So those aren't the areas that I necessarily see the big risks, but I do recognize AI, deepfake technology, the ability to manipulate what's in front of a screen or what's on the screen these days. I do see that as something that we need to be mindful of. It's when we have a global presence and we work in areas where there aren't always nice people, we look at kidnap risk, we look at detentions, we look at those kind of things and how they could potentially be manipulated by today's technology. I perceive that as a convergence between the cyber and the physical, and it's how do we understand how best to manage that moving forward.
Yeah, and I imagine that that's particularly a risk when you're dealing with unstable regimes or environments, perhaps young regimes, corrupt regimes, without making assumptions about where you're operating or who with. And I can imagine that you want as much certainty as possible, and having your people aware that there is potential there for manipulation or tampering or anything like that is an important consideration.
Yeah, and again, when we talk about the physical security aspect, a big
Yeah.
part of what we do is, as you touch on there, Adam, right, is we don't always work in the nicest places, right? We're working, and we, by virtue of what we do, we have to work with all sides of any environment and any conflict to bring about the most suitable sort of interventions that we put in place. So if we look at like pre-trip departure, pre-departure briefings, if you like, of how we brief staff on what to expect, where they could go, how they should behave. Social media, again, we talk about the speed of what that's developed, how people manage their own social media profiles, how they don't give too much information away. Because if we look at the bad actors that we might deal with, information that we may use to check on the validity that they hold someone in a detention or a kidnap, that can often be found on social media. So it's how do we ensure that is managed? There are difficulties around that. We look at some countries around the world are now demanding people don't have private access on their social media because that may affect visa applications and things like that. So again, it's striking a balance between what we can expect from the countries we're visiting versus and their security actors within that versus what the individuals want to display versus what's right to ensure their safety and security when they're traveling. And it's finding a balance between all those sort of areas.
Absolutely. And I imagine things like making sure that people don't have compromising stuff on themselves or on their computers that might be unpalatable to a particular regime if they're going through customs, they're going through checkpoints or whatever it is, and making sure that can't be misconstrued and affect the mission or the security of the individual.
And again, from the sort of security deployment aspect, it's understanding what the implications go to X country could be. Do we send individuals with a sanitized computer, with a sanitized phone that ensures there's not going to be anything on the system that may compromise them? Is are VPNs the right thing to use? Are we able to access what we need to access without that kind of technology in place? And what are the implications of us using a VPN? How does that look to a state security actor if they see a VPN on a system? So yeah, it can become quite challenging.
So I know you talked about hostage retrieval with the prison service. I think it was. Do you do crisis resolution in your current role?
So I would say it's more crisis management than crisis resolution. So as you can imagine, for many people that work in the sector, the approach that we take to working in communities is an acceptance approach. So we're able to gain access to where we go because the community understands why we're there, what that looks like. But inevitably, in those areas, problems arise. We could fall foul of the legal system. We could have a member of staff in detention. That could then escalate to be quite a big incident. So we have quite stringent, and this is across the sector, quite stringent crisis management capabilities. It won't come down to a physical intervention. That's what we won't do. What we will be looking at is how do we get to the point before anything like that can do? How do we bring about a negotiation with actors to get someone released, or how do we work through third parties to gain access and begin a conversation, those kind of things? Or do we need to utilize the in-country legal system? And then we've got our insurances behind that to help sort of manage the risk that goes with those implications too.
Perfect. So it's all those risks that are really adjacent to operating in foreign countries, and you're obviously going to be very reliant on your local fixers and people like that to understand what can and can't be done, and where you need to rely on in
Yeah,
country
yeah. I guess
resources.
yeah, and I'm not a big fan of the term fixer in the sector we're in here because
Okay, that's a
no, no,
no-no,
no,
is
no,
it?
no, 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 no. It's more the fact that we are based in the countries that we work, and the majority of our staff in those countries are of the local communities. They're the national staff for that country. So in terms of the context, we're living there, right? We're living it on a
Gotcha.
day-to-day basis. It's not like we jump in and we jump out. If I look at places like Vietnam and Cambodia, like we've been there for decades, and that's what
Excellent.
allows us to be able to do that kind of work and move us freely and give us the access and the acceptance, as I mentioned, amongst the community because we're in it, we're living it with them.
Fantastic. So you've got people who are integrated with the local community and have the local language skills, and everyone's got an understanding. You're not just interlopers here. Everyone understands why you're there and what you're doing.
And that's the intention. Yes. Yeah.
And did you want to jump in with anything?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose for me, the thing I'm trying to get my mind around is that when I think about security, interestingly, given my background is information technology security and network security, I do think my favourite stories from when I were a kid growing up, and one of my favourite is the Trojan horse. I mean, how much older do you get with security? I mean, there could be people out there who not only don't remember the rotary phone, but don't remember why we call Trojans because of the good old Trojan horse. And for me, I think security is a concept, and kind of what's fascinating, and I don't think we can get to the bottom of it on this engagement, is I wonder what the standard things that are just common knowledge to you, if you like, Richard, are actually completely portable over into the IT world and vice versa, if that makes sense. Because security, right? The fact it's on a computer or it's not, it kind of makes no odds. I'm just trying to think about what are the main issues you get when it comes to security, and then I think, well, if I was starting off, if you give me a job tomorrow and said, right, you're in charge of security for this area, I'm thinking what I'd do using my IT knowledge, and I guess it'd start with, well, a sit rep really. Where are we? Is there a framework for where we should be, and where are the gaps? And I just wondered, how does it work? If you were in a new area tomorrow, what do you do that literally? Do you do a gap analysis in essence?
Yeah, absolutely, Ben. It like you say, whether it be physical security or cyber security, digital security, I think we all have that similar mindset: is how do I identify what the problem is? How do we find those problems and how do we mitigate them? Right. So yeah, for sure, we'll go out, we'll do a gap analysis, we'll do our security risk assessments, our vulnerability assessments, all terms that we're familiar with, both physically and from a cyber perspective. What are our vulnerabilities? How do we manage those vulnerabilities? How do we mitigate the risks against them? So the principles and the frameworks behind it, from a physical perspective, and you guys will certainly be able to answer that. We will have a country security framework. So for every single country that we operate, they will work to the same frameworks of the organization. So we ensure that, risk assessments are in place, country security plans are in place. We've got incident management plans. We've got all our relevant SOPs and actions on for those countries. Almost like your playbooks, right? So it's the similar principle behind all of those things. Whether we could find a more nuanced approach to recognize what our cyber risks are, because I do think it's probably an area within the sector, not necessarily with the organization that I'm with, but certainly within the sector of how does cyber affect what we're doing physically. And I think that's something that we're certainly now beginning to look at and understand where our vulnerabilities are in that and how it crosses over. But to your original point, the frameworks are everything. Without that, I'm going into a brand new country, I'm going to do an assessment. These are what I'm going to look at. What are our gaps? What are our risks? What are our vulnerabilities? And then planning for that. And as I say, my assumption is that's exactly the same as if you're putting a new network in place, you're going into a new client and saying, et cetera, right? Same principle, I would assume.
Yeah, and it's funny because sometimes when I'm talking IT security with people lower down the security maturity curve, I'll use non-IT examples. And I just wonder, do you use terminology? So when you're sort of looking at management risks, do you look at things like reducing risk, avoiding risk, transferring risk, and
Absolutely.
accepting risk? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that whole sort of enterprise risk model and the approach to risk management has found its way into the security world because it's the right terminology, it's the right approach. But yeah, absolutely, risk avoidance, risk transfer. Our risk transfer can be through insurance, or it could be through we use local partners into places that we can't get access. Right, that they've got a much. To your point, Adam, they're in there, they're living it. They're not quite the fixers, but they can get where we can't get, so we work through them. So yeah, and that's a good example of where our risk transfer is. But yeah, reducing risk transfer, risk avoidance, it's all the same terminology.
And I think that leads me to the one that I don't like to talk about, which is the one we should never do, which is ignore risk. And clearly, from our previous conversations, when it comes to cyber, you're certainly not ignoring the risk. It's just not as obvious given what you do and by nature of how you do it and your job role to be top of your list. But something you said was, from a cyber viewpoint, well, who's going to kind of come after us? And now I think Adam's more qualified than I to dig into it. But my thoughts are, not from a fear, uncertainty, and doubt viewpoint, just from a being honest viewpoint. Have you things to comment on that, for Richard, as in the sense that if I were a charity, I might think I'm not at risk, but then I'm thinking about things like we talked about NotPetya earlier, which was specifically a sort of nation state attack, which bled into a corporate attack. And I'm just thinking, even though people, you'd like to think the bad guys even have got some kind of heart and they won't go after a charity, is there a chance that there's bleed over, or in your experience, the bad guys say, I don't care if a charity's got money, I'm going for it. What would you advise, Richard, on that front?
So with the charity side of things, unfortunately, I've been involved in several cases where charities have been targeted and experienced fairly significant compromises, and I think so. I actually had a question about this from the NGO perspective, but my advice as a practitioner would very much be to focus on fundamentals first and foremost. Do what you can with reasonably limited resources, and be pragmatic. You don't need to just because you're going to your sort of decision makers and your board and saying, oh, we're gonna sort of make a really real push for cybersecurity and really increase our maturity here, doesn't mean you need to go and buy all the shiny tools under the sun. So there's so much good free resources out there. There's so much good advice that you can pick up from people like NCSC, who obviously know what they're talking about and very much have a stake in the game. And you need to be thinking about like segregating your networks. You need to be thinking about making sure you've got that awareness piece for your people. And it always already seems, because of the nature of your work, and there's that very real physical risk component, you already do a lot of awareness stuff with your people. And it's not going to be a stretch to add some sort of cybersecurity stuff onto that as well, because if you've got people, crossing borders and working in delicate places, it's not a stretch for people to think, that I need to be aware of some digital stuff going on now. Whereas I think almost in the IT space, it's harder because people just think, oh, why me? I'm not interesting. Whereas your people have a more of an understanding, perhaps, that risk is perhaps places where you don't expect it, or you can be at risk just by dint of your nationality or being in a delicate place. So I think segregating out your risk is really important. I think having that awareness piece, leveraging free resources to harden your systems and make them hard to attack. Don't just use stuff out of the box. Change defaults and passwords, things like that, and you'd be in a better place quite quickly without blowing the bank. Of course, stuff like MFA as well. Should probably give that a mention.
But I mean, I think I think we'd be very naive to say that we wouldn't ever be exposed to some form of attack. That would be very, very
Yeah.
naive. And maybe my thinking is there are certainly, on the scale, on the spectrum, there are better targets than what we are in terms of impact, a visual impact, a global impact from a hacker group than what you might get from them. They may lose some
Yes.
credibility if they were seen to be attacking a charity, but for sure, we know they've happened. And I think a lot of that could be context driven. If we see an organization that's in the press for, the wrong reasons, right, that
Sure.
might generate interest. They could see them be subject to an attack of sorts. But again, Adam, right, resources are tight, right? Finances are tight. We are a charity at the end of the day, and it's difficult to generate funding from both institutional donors like governments, as well as generate funding and charitable donations from the public. So resources are tight. So learning where those resources are from a free perspective, NCSC, and all those bits and pieces is really, really helpful. Do I, and this is my personal view, this doesn't reflect my organization at all,
Sure.
but do I think we're quite immature in that position? Yes, I do. Again, from a sector perspective, and I think there's a lot of learning to be out there, and that's why it's great to be involved on a podcast such as this and get to link up with people that have got that knowledge that can help us, or certainly help me with my understanding and maturity of where do we go to improve that, which in turn assists me with the physical security of our people. If we can avoid their systems being exploited, that's instantly keeping them much safer when they're 1,000 miles away in a different country. Those kind of things, because if I'm traveling generally, I'm taking my laptop with my data and my information with me, and that's the same for most of our international travelers. So it's, if we've got our MFA in place and we've got all of those right passwords and we've got the right, the 12 digits and its numbers and its alphanumeric and all of that, it seems simple, but it's effective, and that helps us prevent that exploitation and in turn keep the people safe and secure when they're traveling or when they're in countries.
Yeah, and I think another thing from days gone by, I used to remember going and standing on a railway platform, and British Rail, as were at the time, used to advertise how much they weren't on time. And I used to look at it and think, they're never going to be 100% on time. And over time working in security, I've come to realise with security, there's no such thing as 100% security. And we have worked obviously with organisations where, budget's always an issue, but it's not really an issue. And they've got multiple people in their security teams when it comes to information and digital. They're not really worried about staff size. They've got all the shiny kit. They've got everything they actually need. They're still the ones in the news sometimes because of the nature of the world we live in. And it's like, when I first came into security, I thought the idea was to get secure and to pick a framework and adhere to a framework and go, we've done it. And I now realise, regardless of where you are on that curve, it's about resilience. And it's about if and when, it's getting more when for most people, something happens, how are we going to deal with it? And from a free viewpoint, which is important to smaller organisations, to non-profit making organisations, again, the advice we'd always give is, let's look at the things we can do that are more time-based costs as opposed to monetary cost. And one of the biggest bits of advice is to consider, are we better off in a world where if something happens, we've got a nice playbook to follow that we've been practicing and practicing and practicing? Or are we better off going, what should we do now? And it's clear what the answer is. So again, yeah, and a big reason for the podcast is exactly what you've sort of alluded to there, Richard, which is to connect you with other people who have gone further down that path and are in a position to offer advice. Because I think one thing about the community is we're all here to help each other, and we're all aware that the constraints of budget and resource are real. And when you're dealing in what you're dealing in, it's not just the money side, it's the people side as well. It's like, it's frantically important that everything is shared as much as you can when we're dealing with security, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And to flip the coin on that, we can't eliminate risk. We just reduce risk, right? That's what we do. And Adam, I think it was you that mentioned being pragmatic. Pragmatism is the name of the game. We can have all the bells and whistles. We can have the greatest frameworks in the world, but they're not going to stand up to every trial and tribulation that we're faced with. And we have to have that ability to, diverge and be pragmatic in our approach. But one thing I can say is, what we deal with, probably more than your average corporate, is we deal with crisis on a daily basis. Just before this call, I was involved in a call that was in that realm, right? And it's that's certainly what I can bring is how do you formulate that? How does that look like? What does that look like? Because it's something that we deal with on a daily basis. So I'll pick your contact brains, and now I'm more than welcome to pick mine in areas that I can support them.
Absolutely.
That's for sure. But yeah, I think going back to the cyber position that we hold currently, or in my opinion, the sort of sector is not naive to it. I think we're recognizing that technology is shifting and we need to get on board with it. Even if we talk about things like CCTV, it's what systems can't we use? What systems can we use? We're working in countries with sanctions and different things. Should we use this system? We know that system's open to vulnerabilities, but it's understanding all of that. So the learning is there, and I think it's getting much, much better. Some organisations are further along the path than others within the sector. Some have dedicated teams to this currently, others don't, and it is resource intensive. It can be costly, but looking at the free view aspect, as you mentioned, then that's the start standard, right? If we get to that point and get people talking about it, we can see where we can get, then that's where I'd like to see things progress for us, for sure.
And the other thing I wanted to briefly touch on regarding the risk, particularly of charities, but broadly smaller businesses perhaps that aren't as much of a target as, say, banks, the technology sector, governments, things like that. Quite often, and this is the thing that people don't think about. They think, oh, we're not that interesting, or we're not that big, or whatever it is. All these excuses we make, and they don't think that actually you might be subject to an attack simply because you use a particular piece of technology that is exposed to the internet, and the attackers are just going around the internet scooping up. They don't know who you are. They don't particularly care. You just happen to be someone who uses this particular technology, or you might be part of a data breach, and one of your employees has had their credentials compromised, and they're just going down the list of okay, this one's next. Does it work? Yes. Okay, we're in. Let's escalate our access. What can we do with that? So quite often you're caught up in other things. Perhaps you're working with someone who is interesting. Perhaps you're working with a defense company. Perhaps you're being targeted just because of the nationality that you're registered in. If you're a British company, maybe you're being targeted on that basis, or you're working in a particular area of the world. And I think it's having that appreciation that you can be targeted for other reasons other than I'm the main character.
And it's interesting that you just got me thinking there, Adam. If I was to flip that on its head, it might not be we're targeted for an attack. If I look at like the equipment used out in Ukraine for satellite comms right now, that was going to get turned off at one point, in terms of communication from, right? If we're using that technology, like a lot of organizations are using the SATCOMs technology that, dare I say, Elon Musk has responsibility for. The minute he says we're going to turn that off, the implications on us would be significant. So it's not necessarily an attack from the baddies, for want of a better term, but we can also be implicated in that way as well, right? That the technology is suddenly obsolete, is suddenly out of date, and if we haven't maintained the speed, or we've kept that right sort of understanding of what we need, we could also be massively impacted overnight. Changes in sat phone satellites, etc. All of those things are things that we need to stay abreast of as well. But to your point, yes, I think you're valid. I think that it's a very valid point by virtue of who we work with, or what we're perceived as doing could have implications, and without going into it too much, we pretty much are governed by what we call the humanitarian principles: impartiality, neutrality, and humanity, etc. So it's very much about us being very transparent, open. This is who we're working with. But by virtue of the work that Mines Advisory Group do, it's demining. It's potentially seen as quite military within the humanitarian sector. It's not. It's humanitarian mine action. It's about returning that land back to the communities, if you like. But the perception of dealing with firearms, with landmines, etc., it carries a certain connotation potentially. So that's again something we have to be mindful in terms of what is the perception of the organisation and how do we ensure everyone understands that we are adhering to those humanitarian principles, because we may inadvertently attract that unwanted attention that you've mentioned. That's not the case. That hasn't happened, but it's something that resonates in the thinking of how do we mitigate that risk through, our branding, what our perception is,
Sure.
all those kind of things. So yeah, it's a very valid point.
So staying with that, with your branding, your messaging, your PR, I imagine it's very important in the countries that you're working that the populace, the government, understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, who you are, and doing as much as you can to break down those military connotations and help them understand how and why you operate.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. I don't want to get too much into what we do as an organisation. I don't really want to represent the views of the organisation too much, because
Understood.
it can be quite challenging. But speaking broadly, yeah, and it can be challenging. If you look at countries, I'll use Syria again as an example of you've got a recently changed regime, the regime change, and now a new government in place, and then you've got the Kurdish side of Syria. There are a lot of different entities in play that you need to ensure that you are engaging with, that you're registered with, that you're going through the right coordination processes, and it's a huge machine behind the whole thing, and that's not just the connotations for Minds Advisory Group, but for every NGO that's working, in order for them to deliver the coordination mechanisms, the registration mechanisms, the delivery of their message has to be on point, and has to be done the right way, because you can fall foul very quickly if you sort of divert from a necessary procedure. But at the same time, our job is life-saving activities, and it's the humanitarian need that will often take precedent.
Absolutely. So I think one of the problems we have, certainly in the more IT focused world of cybersecurity, is translating what we do into plain English and explaining it up to decision makers. Would you say there's an analog with that for the physical realm?
100%, right? And I think you'll probably pick up from the way I talk. I'm quite a plain speaker. I like to keep it simple, right? I think back to my army days. We used to have a mnemonic: KISS, keep it simple, stupid, right? And that's how it should be. I'm not a big fan of huge security jargon. I'm not a big fan of long words. We can discombobulate people all day long with that, can't we? So
short words, primary colours.
Absolutely right. And it goes back to that pragmatism, right? It's if we can be pragmatic and we can explain it in a simple way that says we should do this to prevent this, and X, Y, Z will be the result, then that's how we need to do it. We can, amongst your peers, you can go into the technical terminology all day long, but I think if you need to deliver a message on point, whether that be in a crisis management meeting, whether that be in a senior leadership meeting, or whether that just be down to the basic individual, not the basic individual, that's not the right term, but down to the individual on the ground, to help them understand their responsibilities. I am a big believer in keeping it simple, because it definitely isn't unique to the IT cyber kind of thing. But it can be a challenge. It can be a challenge.
And I think the big, what sort of a subset of that problem is, if you're not directly involved in the work yourself, you're not one of the people on the ground as a practitioner in country, whatever it might be, perhaps a decision maker might say, oh, well, could that really happen to us? Is that a thing? Really? Do we need to take all this effort? And really ramming home like, no, this is a real risk you need to seriously consider and plan for.
Yeah, it's that risk advisor, risk owner sort of gameplay, right? And that's where I currently sit now. I believe very much in the servant leader approach. Is how can I help? My job at the global level is to support the people in country. What do they need to unburden them and allow them to deliver programs?
Gotcha.
And it will get to a point sometimes like, well, this is the advice that I'm giving, and this is the reason we're giving. If you choose not, it's that constant informed sort of messaging, right? This is what we advise. This is why we advise it. If you don't do that, these are the implications. Almost putting the onus back on the individual. Go, yeah, it might not happen, but if it did, this is the outcome, and you own that risk. So it's very much about how you articulate them owning it versus the advice that me and my teams are giving. Does that kind of answer
that makes sense?
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it's because inevitably, I go back to being in Vietnam and Cambodia for years and years and years, decades. People become accustomed to the culture, to the lifestyle, and it's, well, that never happens here, therefore we don't need to think about it. That's a bigger concern to me, because you're almost ingrained so far that you can't see the potential risk. So it's bringing people out of that mindset and saying, it might not have, but there's always the potential for it to happen, and how we score that, and how we grade that, and how we rate that one.
Yes, what one of my old colleagues charitably called a lack of imagination.
Indeed.
Yeah. So I'm very aware that we're sort of getting along in time, and you've got a hard stop coming up. So I think my last thing, unless you have anything you want to particularly go for, Vin. So I know you have to be a bit cautious because of the nature of your work, your employer. You must have some excellent stories. We do like to ask for a good story. Have you got sort of more sort of PR approved ones, should we say, that you can divulge?
You caught me on the hot there. You should have prepped me on that one.
No, don't worry at all. Vin did this to me on our very first podcast.
I've got a ton of stories. Maybe we'll get to them down the line if we do this again.
We will do that another time then. I absolutely appreciate that. Vin did it to me on our very first podcast, and I was like, what can I say? What can't I say?
Yeah.
And I got something out, but oh dear me, it was a mess.
It's one of those moments where you think all of the funny ones just disappear from your head, right? But no, listen, if we do this again, I will come with you pre-prepared.
Yeah, and it's never quite as good when you're having to self-censor as you get it out.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, we'll definitely do it again, Richard, because I think for me, I've really enjoyed the podcast, and it's really started to tick a box. Not ticked it all yet, but that box of, you have got so much to offer our world, and I'd hope that we can certainly help you in your world, be it that it's you personally or you pass it on to the group at large. But I think it'd be remiss not to have you in future podcasts, because I think your experience in security is clear to see, and because it's not digital in information, it'll make people think differently the way we're going with this podcast. Because in general, with our podcast series, we've already worked out that future cast, we're going to go down a panel route, and we'd love to have you back. If you've time and you accept, you'll be certainly seeing us again, sir, to join us again. But no, I've really enjoyed that today. It's been fascinating. Thank you.
No, thank you both for inviting me. And yeah, I'd love to. And as I say, I will come story prepared.
Oh, no, we look forward to it.